She waited alone at the railway depot, tears mixing with raindrops on her wedding gown. Nobody had come for her. He was merely passing through this forgotten town, a widower raising his child alone, with nothing more to offer anyone. But when their gazes connected through the downpour, something shifted. Not just for her, but for all three of them. Before we begin, if you believe in unexpected meetings, in simple acts of compassion, and in tales that mend wounded spirits, please consider subscribing to our channel. Now let's begin. The drizzle started gently, barely audible against the roof of the aging truck. By the time Nathan Miller pulled into the graveled parking area beside the train depot, it had transformed into a steady deluge. He switched off the engine and listened. Raindrops pattered against the windshield like a gentle, melancholy song, the kind that made memories surface unbidden. In the seat beside him, 6-year-old Jacob leaned forward, pressing his forehead to the glass. His small voice broke the silence. "Dad, why is that lady in a fancy dress crying outside?" Nathan followed his son's gaze. Across the platform, beneath the rusty metal overhang of the nearly deserted station, sat a woman in a white bridal gown, drenched, motionless, hugging herself as though trying to hold something broken together. The fabric clung heavily to her form, soaked through. Her flowers, if she'd had any, were nowhere to be seen. All that remained was a small-wheeled suitcase and a veil tangled in her dark hair. Nathan blinked twice, wondering if what he witnessed was real. She resembled a specter from another era, or perhaps from his own past. He nearly said, "Don't look, Jacob." But something in his son's wide eyes stopped the words. It wasn't curiosity reflected there. It was genuine worry. "She looks really sad," Jacob whispered. "We should check if she's okay." Nathan hesitated. He wasn't someone who involved himself in the stranger's problems anymore. He carried enough of his own: debt, grief, and a future patched together with determination and fragile optimism. But the woman hadn't moved. She hadn't even shifted to escape the downpour. With a resigned sigh, Nathan grabbed his worn denim jacket and pushed open the door. The chill hit him immediately, followed by the drumming sound of the rain, a curtain of gray that blurred everything beyond arm's reach. "Wait here," he instructed Jacob. "I'll be back in a minute." He crossed the lot, boots sinking into muddy puddles, and stepped onto the platform. The woman didn't look up until his shadow fell across her lap. "Are you all right, miss?" he asked, voice gentle but clear. She raised her head. Her eyes were puffy, cheeks flushed with tears. But despite her obvious distress, there was something dignified about her, something resilient. She blinked as if struggling to focus. I missed my train," she said, barely audible above the rainfall. "Or perhaps it missed me." Nathan glanced toward the empty tracks. No arrivals, no departures, just emptiness stretching into gray distance. "I can't just sit here forever," she murmured. "Where were you heading?" he asked. She gave a hollow laugh. "Nowhere, apparently. I'm no longer welcome there." Nathan struggled for an appropriate response. She pulled the veil from her hair and folded it methodically in her lap. "It was supposed to happen today," she said. "The wedding. He texted me half an hour before, said he couldn't go through with it, that I was too much of a risk, too complicated, and not what his mother had in mind." Nathan maintained a neutral expression, but something inside him shifted. He knew nothing about this woman, but he recognized that particular brand of pain. It settled deep in the bones, quiet and persistent. "What's your name?" he asked. She looked at him as though no one had posed that question in a very long time. "Sarah," she said. "Sarah Bennett." "I'm Nathan," he replied with a single nod. "Nathan Miller." He removed his jacket and offered it to her. "You'll catch cold in that dress." She stared at the garment momentarily, then accepted it slowly, as if it might dissolve in her hands. "Thank you." "Hungry?" he asked. Sarah paused. "I don't know. I haven't felt anything since this morning." "Well," he said, tilting his head toward the truck, My boy and I have half a turkey sandwich and some potato chips. That's luxury dining around here. For the first time, a hint of a smile touched her lips. Turkey sandwich, huh? You certainly know how to impress a lady. Nathan shrugged. It's not much, but it's not wet. So there's that. She stood carefully, her sodden dress dragging, and followed him toward the truck. Jacob rolled down his window. Is she okay? Nathan glanced back. She will be. Sarah climbed into the back seat, trying not to soak the upholstery too badly, though it was already torn in several places. She looked at the boy beside her, who offered her the bag of chips with a shy smile. Hi, he said. I'm Jacob. You can have the bigger half. Sarah accepted the bag, eyes growing misty again. But these tears felt different. Thank you, Jacob. That's very generous of you. He beamed. Dad says nice people make the rain stop faster. Nathan raised an eyebrow. I did say that. Jacob nodded vigorously. Last week when I cried because Mom's picture got wet. Sarah turned to Nathan. You lost your wife? He nodded. 2 years ago, highway accident. I'm sorry, she said softly. He didn't respond, just turned the key and let the old engine rattle to life. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the rainfall. 3 strangers united by heartbreak, turkey sandwiches, and a disrupted train schedule. But as minutes passed, something began to settle, like dust clearing from a long-closed window. Sarah gazed out at the station where she'd been abandoned, and perhaps, just perhaps, she'd been left behind so someone else could find her. The rain had lightened to a gentle mist by the time Nathan parked his truck beside the small country church, an old weather-beaten building just off the main road, long neglected except by memories and birdsong. Moss climbed the walls like decoration, and the faded wooden cross above the entrance appeared to have been painted in a previous decade. Nathan cut the engine and glanced over his shoulder. Sarah sat in the back seat, still in her wedding dress, though it had begun to dry into a rumpled shadow of what it once was. Her hair hung damp against her neck. Her eyes looked distant. Doing okay? He asked. She nodded, though it wasn't convincing. Thought we could wait out the rest of the shower here, Nathan said. My grandfather used to preach in this place. Still has a spare key hidden under the rock somewhere. Sarah examined the church as though it might collapse with a strong breeze. It's beautiful, she whispered, and Nathan wasn't certain if she meant it or if she was simply grateful for anything not drenched or cruel. Jacob jumped from the truck, eager and shoeless now, splashing through puddles without concern. He ran up the church steps and began hunting for the key, humming as he searched. Sarah watched him intently. He's radiant, she said. Almost too bright, Nathan replied with a slight smile. He keeps me from slipping into darkness. Something flickered in Sarah's expression then. A moment, brief but piercing, as though she was trying to recall what it felt like to believe someone could say such things and truly mean them. Inside the church, the air smelled of aged pine and forgotten prayers. Dust particles danced in the fading light, filtering through stained glass. Several broken pews remained standing, angled like faithful sentinels. In the distant corner, a cracked piano rested in silence, its keys yellowed but intact. They settled into the front row. Sarah sat carefully, smoothing her dress fabric, though it was hopelessly wrinkled. Nathan handed her a dry blanket from the truck, which she wrapped around her shoulders without comment. Jacob found a pew just behind them and began quietly constructing a tower using hymn books. For a long while, no one spoke, the kind of silence that wasn't uncomfortable, but sacred. Then Sarah broke it. His name was David. Nathan looked at her, but remained silent. I met him at a hospital fundraiser. He owned several dental practices. Charming, polished, everything in perfect order. Said he appreciated women who were self-assured. She gave a short, humorless laugh. Turns out he appreciated that until his mother convinced him otherwise. Nathan leaned back, arms crossed. What did she say? That I was too established, too grounded, too tired-looking, and too close to 40. He didn't hide his wince. That's quite a collection of twos. Sarah nodded. She said he needed someone more photogenic. I guess I failed the visual assessment. Nathan's hands tensed slightly in his lap. He had no words for such meanness, disguised as concern. He called me 30 minutes before the ceremony, Sarah continued, eyes unfocused. Said the timing wasn't right. Said I was lovely, but not the right material for his legacy. Her voice cracked. Whatever that means. There it was again, that heaviness pressing on her chest like a boulder. And Nathan recognized it intimately. Grief that didn't scream, just compressed. You didn't deserve that, he said quietly. No, Sarah replied. But I believed it completely for about 20 minutes. I accepted every word. That's why I couldn't leave the station. I wasn't waiting for him. I was trying to decide if I still existed without his validation. That silenced Nathan, not because he couldn't comprehend, but because he understood too perfectly. I sat there, she whispered, in the dress I purchased myself. No bridesmaids, no family, no contingency plan. Just me, a 38-year-old woman in a puddle of white, with nobody to tell me I still mattered. She turned to him then. And then you appeared. Nathan looked away, jaw tightening, not from anger, but because something in her words cut deeply. He remembered standing alone at his wife's funeral, clutching Jacob's hands so tightly the boy's fingers turned white. Yet no one had assured him he would survive. No one told him he still existed. I didn't do anything special, he finally said. You stopped, Sarah replied. That's everything. Outside, the rain intensified again, tapping gently on the roof like a lullaby searching for its rhythm. Sarah glanced at the cracked piano. Do you think it still works? Nathan shrugged. Only one way to discover that. She stood and crossed the dusty floor. Gently, like unwrapping a tender wound, she lifted the lid and touched a key. It resonated soft, melancholic, slightly out of tune, but alive. She pressed more notes, assembling a melody, something familiar, something haunting. Jacob halted his tower building and listened, chin resting on the back of the pew. Sarah played with her eyes closed, letting the music express what words couldn't. It wasn't flawless, but it was beautiful because it came from her soul. When she finished, the room held its breath. That, Nathan said, was the most sincere thing I've heard in years. Sarah turned, eyes glistening. It's the only voice I've ever truly trusted. Music never deceives, he nodded. Neither do young children, and mine already admires you. Jacob grinned broadly. Can she come with us? Sarah laughed, a genuine one this time. It startled her, startled all of them. I don't even know your destination, she said. Nathan smiled. Not sure it matters anymore. Wherever it is, I think it just improved. And as the rain resumed, steady and persistent, Sarah realized it wasn't trying to drown her this time. It was washing something clean. Morning arrived unhurriedly, like an uncertain visitor. The clouds hung low over the Midwestern plains, painting the landscape in muted grays and gentle ambers. Mist rolled lazily across the fields, as though careful not to disturb the earth beneath. Inside the old church, Sarah stirred first. She had fallen asleep curled on a pew beneath a faded quilt Nathan had discovered in a forgotten cabinet. Her wedding dress remained slightly damp, but no longer clung to her skin like shame. It felt lighter now, just fabric, no longer a symbol of rejection. She sat up slowly, careful not to wake Jacob, who had fallen asleep beside her, his small head resting gently against her shoulder. The boy's breathing was steady, innocent. His presence had grounded her through yesterday's tempest, like an unexpected anchor. Across the room, Nathan was already awake, standing by the open door of the church, one foot resting on the threshold. He was gazing into the early fog, shoulders relaxed, arms crossed, not tensely, but thoughtfully. Sarah stood, pulling the blanket tighter, and walked toward him. Couldn't sleep? She asked softly. He shook his head, glancing at her with that quiet steadiness she was beginning to trust. Got accustomed to pre-dawn hours working the fields. My body wakes before my mind realizes it. She smiled faintly. I used to dread mornings, but today feels like something new. Nathan looked back into the mist. Ever watched a storm depart? She followed his gaze. I suppose I usually wait for sunshine before looking outside. That's the thing, he said, voice low. There's beauty in the departure, too. It's gentler, more honest. They stood in silence for a moment, watching clouds separate above distant trees. Birdsong gradually returned to the world like timid guests arriving late to a gathering. A single beam of sunlight pierced the sky, slanting across the field. Looks like we weathered it, Sarah whispered. Nathan nodded. Survived worse, I imagine. She turned to him then, curious. Tell me about her. Your wife. He didn't flinch, didn't tense, but the atmosphere around him shifted. Her name was Rachel, he said after a pause. She laughed without restraint, never apologized for it. She smelled like cherries in summer and vanilla in winter. She baked bread that could bring grown men to tears. I still don't understand how. Sarah smiled gently. Sounds like you loved her profoundly. I still do, he said without hesitation. But grief doesn't mean life stops. It just means you carry someone differently. That struck Sarah in her core, not painfully, but in a way that created space. I've never married, she said, her voice soft. Came close several times, but I always seemed to be someone's temporary dream, never the permanent kind. Nathan looked at her directly then. Ever consider that perhaps they simply didn't deserve you? Sarah looked away, blinking rapidly. I used to. Then I stopped allowing myself to think anything positive. Well, Nathan said, leaning slightly against the doorframe, maybe it's time to begin again. She stared at him, uncertain how someone so reserved could speak words that illuminated the darkness. Behind them, Jacob stirred and sat up, hair pointing in all directions. Is it morning already? He yawned. Sure is, kiddo, Nathan replied. And you're drooling on the lady's dress. Jacob blushed and wiped his mouth. Sorry, Miss Sarah. She laughed genuinely. You made it warmer. They spent the next hour tidying the church, not because they needed to, but because it felt appropriate. Jacob collected old hymnals and arranged them on the altar like treasures. Sarah dusted the piano and opened windows. Nathan swept the floor and straightened pews, as though Sunday service might still happen somewhere in his memory. There was no plan, no destination, but for the first time in many years, none of them seemed troubled by that. I know it's deteriorating, Sarah said, running her fingers along the cracked wood of the pulpit. But this place feels like it remembers people. Nathan looked up from where he was stacking chairs. It does. She turned. You think so? I do. Places like this hold echoes, prayers, promises, maybe even second chances. Sarah contemplated that. Let it settle. She'd been searching for a fresh start her entire life. And here, in a place abandoned by time, it felt like she had stumbled into one. By midday, the sun had fully emerged. The storm had officially passed. Jacob discovered a box of old candles in the back room, most half-melted, but still usable. Nathan helped him arrange them across the windowsills. When lit, they filled the church with a glow, not magnificent, but welcoming. It wasn't a cathedral, it wasn't a wedding venue, but it was enough. Sarah stood near the altar, observing what they had created from neglect. I can't explain it, she said, but it feels like I've been waiting to arrive exactly here. Nathan moved beside her. Sometime, he said, life places us where we never planned to be, precisely so we can finally stop running. She nodded, swallowing the emotion rising in her throat. I don't know my next step, she confessed. Neither do I, he admitted. They looked at each other. The silence between them was no longer awkward. It was an invitation. And just outside the open church door, the cross stood against the sky, simple, wooden, and weathered, but still standing, just like them. The old church had no kitchen, no functioning stove, no dining table polished by generations. But that scarcely mattered because sometimes the heart remembers meals not by the food, but by the hands that shared it. Nathan stood behind the truck, searching through a small cooler he kept for emergencies. Inside were two pears, a chunk of white cheddar wrapped in wax paper, and a loaf of bread just past fresh. A plastic jar of honey rolled to one side. He glanced at Sarah, sitting on the church steps with Jacob beside her. The boy was explaining how caterpillars sometimes pretend to be twigs to avoid being eaten. She listened as though he was revealing universal secrets, smiling with that gentle, attentive expression Nathan hadn't witnessed in a woman in years. He returned with his modest offerings. "Nothing fancy, I'm afraid," he said, setting the items on a pew they'd pulled forward as an improvised table. Sarah stood and joined him, taking the bread into her hands. "Are you kidding? This surpasses most first dates I've experienced." Jacob beamed. "I love honey and cheese." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "Together?" He nodded enthusiastically. "Dad says it's a country invention." Nathan shrugged. "Lean times, and it keeps you going." Sarah laughed, and together they assembled their humble feast, slicing cheese with a pocket knife, spreading honey with the back of a plastic spoon, dividing pears with surgical precision. They sat in a circle on the church floor, candles still flickering in the windows behind them, the sun warming the wooden walls. For a moment it felt almost holy. Halfway through her sandwich, Sarah lowered it to her lap and closed her eyes. "This reminds me of my grandmother," she said quietly. Nathan watched her, attentive. "She used to make honey and apple sandwiches for school, even when we barely had enough for dinner. Said it was her way of sending her strength with me." Sarah smiled, eyes still closed. "I was embarrassed by them then. Thought they marked me as poor. Now I'd give anything to taste one she made again." Nathan's voice softened. "Is she still living?" Sarah shook her head. "Passed 4 years ago. Cancer. The quiet kind that doesn't announce itself, just whispers until it's too late." "I'm sorry," Nathan said. "She died 3 weeks before I met David," Sarah continued, opening her eyes. "He didn't appreciate conversations about loss. Said they made everything too somber." "That's not grief's fault," Nathan said. "It's just honest. People don't welcome honesty unless it's comfortable." She regarded him then, not with surprise, but with something resembling relief. "I think you might be the first man I've known who doesn't try to fix broken things with silence." Nathan smiled faintly. "Silence never repaired anything for me. It just amplified the emptiness." Sarah nodded slowly. "Yes, that's exactly what it does." Jacob finished his sandwich, then started exploring the hymnals again. "Do you know any songs?" he asked Sarah, holding one up. She smiled. "A few." "Can you sing one?" She hesitated. "Only if your father promises not to laugh." Nathan raised both hands. Not even a smile. Sarah cleared her throat and began humming softly. Then in a voice rich and warm with a subtle ache, she sang an old hymn. "Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound." Her voice filled the church like sunlight through stained glass. Soft and sure, imperfect but genuine. Nathan remained motionless, breathless. It was like witnessing something bloom in winter. When she finished, Jacob clapped once and then hugged her without warning. "That was prettier than the radio," he declared. Sarah embraced him in return, her eyes damp. "Thank you, sweetheart." Nathan looked away, pretending to secure the honey jar, but his chest felt constricted. It wasn't the song that affected him. It was what followed. Silence. The kind that doesn't leave you feeling vacant, but fulfilled. As afternoon lengthened, they stepped outside for fresh air. The rain had cleansed everything. The dirt path leading to the church glistened in the sun, steam rising as though the earth was exhaling. Sarah wandered to the edge of the small cemetery behind the building. She knelt beside a headstone so weathered the name had vanished. She touched the stone gently, respectfully. "Someone loved you," she whispered. "And I think perhaps that's sufficient." Nathan observed from a distance, giving her space. He remembered what it felt like to need silence for healing. Not isolation, but the kind of quiet where someone remained nearby, just not demanding anything. When she returned, Sarah appeared calmer, unburdened. "Thank you," she said simply. "For what?" "For letting me feel human today. Not a mistake, not a problem requiring solution. Nathan met her gaze. Sarah, you were never unwanted. You were just waiting to be truly seen. She looked as though she might cry again, but this time she didn't. Instead, she stood straighter, as though something had shifted within her, a small resurrection. That evening, they gathered candles again, lit them anew, and sat on the church steps, watching the final rays of sun bleed into the horizon. Nathan remained mostly quiet, but he didn't need to speak. Sarah rested her head gently against his shoulder, and Jacob curled beside her with a blanket across his knees. And as crickets began their chorus and night settled around them, Nathan thought, perhaps kindness doesn't heal everything, but maybe, just maybe, it provides enough light for people to find their way forward. By late morning, sunlight had dried the church steps and warmed the old pews to a comfortable temperature. Birds flitted through the broken window panes, unbothered by the presence of three unlikely companions, who for one fleeting weekend had transformed ruins into sanctuary. Sarah stood near the doorway, fingers brushing the now stiff hem of her wedding dress. It had dried overnight, but its weight, emotional more than physical, still clung to her like an unwanted memory. She had slept in it, eaten in it, sat on rough wood in it, and now after everything, it felt less like formal attire and more like a costume she no longer wished to wear. Nathan entered from outside carrying an armful of split firewood. He paused when he saw her standing there, hands clenched at her sides, an expression unreadable. "Everything all right?" he asked gently. Sarah nodded, but then shook her head. "No," she said almost as confession. "Not really." He didn't press. He simply placed the wood near the small fireplace and waited. The way you wait for a storm that isn't yours to pass. "I need to remove this," she said finally, voice raw. Nathan glanced at the dress but said nothing. "I've been carrying it around like it represents something," Sarah continued, "as if by holding on long enough, it might transform into something meaningful. But it won't. It was never worn for love. Just expectation, image, hope perhaps, but not love." Nathan took a measured breath, nodding once. She turned and walked toward the back of the church, where a small storage room still contained remnants of religious life. Baptismal garments, worn Bibles, broken candelabras. 10 minutes later, she reappeared. Gone was the white dress. She wore a simple flannel shirt of Nathan's, oversized in the shoulders, sleeves rolled up, tucked into a pair of jeans someone had left folded in a cupboard. Her hair was pulled back loosely, damp from being rinsed in the church's rain barrel. She looked more authentic than she had before, and Nathan saw it, the quiet liberation, the subtle reclaiming. Sarah carried the dress carefully in her arms as she stepped outside. Each step measured, deliberate. The wind tugged at the fabric gently, as though it too was ready to release. Nathan followed behind her, but asked no questions. She walked to the tree just beyond the church, an old gnarled oak that stood solitary like a guardian of memories. Beneath its shade, she laid the dress across a wooden bench, the material catching light like crystal. Then, without dramatics, without tears, she sat beside it and gazed ahead. Nathan waited a few paces away. When she finally spoke, her voice was distant but steady. "I believe this dress would transform everything. Thought it would make me feel chosen, valued, worthwhile." She looked down. "But all it ever did was remind me I was waiting for someone to love me loudly enough to prove I wasn't damaged. But you were never deficient. Not for one moment. And I'm sorry it took collapsing at a train station for the world to notice. But you stood up again and walked, rain-soaked, mascara-streaked, into a stranger's vehicle. And somehow that man returned your dignity." The silence between them stretched, but it wasn't empty. Nathan stepped forward. "May I join you?" She nodded. He lowered himself beside her, forearms on his knees, not looking directly at her. "I remember the last time Rachel wore her favorite dress," he said quietly. "It was green cotton, incredibly soft. She wore it the day Jacob spoke his first sentence. Said she wanted to be comfortable while chasing him around." Sarah turned slightly toward him. "I kept that dress for almost 2 years after she passed," Nathan continued, folded it, washed it, obviously never wore it, but I'd place it beside me sometimes, just to recall what existence felt like when she filled the room. He paused. The breeze moved gently through the branches. One morning I took it to the clothesline. I hung it up, watched it dance in the wind, and then I let the wind have it. Sarah stared at him, eyes glossy. I'm not suggesting you burn it or bury it, Nathan said, but perhaps you don't need to carry it anymore. They sat in silence for a while longer. Jacob's laughter drifted from inside the church as he played with an old harmonica someone had left behind. Sarah eventually stood, gathered the dress into her arms again, and walked to a tree stump nearby. She folded it neatly as though tucking away a chapter of herself and placed it down. She turned to Nathan. I'm finished letting symbols define me. Nathan smiled. You were never the dress. She moved closer. And you're not the grief. For a heartbeat, something suspended in the space between them. Unspoken, delicate, sacred. Then Sarah reached out and took his hand. Not because she needed rescuing, but because he hadn't tried to rescue her. Later that afternoon, a light rain began to fall again. Not heavy, not harsh, just soft enough to patter across the church roof like a familiar melody. Sarah stepped outside and looked toward the stump. The dress remained there, soaked once more. But this time it didn't hurt. This time the rain felt like blessing. And Sarah, finally free of fabric and false promises, lifted her face to the sky and let it wash her clean. The rain had come and gone again by the time late afternoon sun stretched across the horizon like a golden blanket. The fields shimmered amber beyond the church, and vapor rose gently from the warming earth. It was the kind of quiet that only follows a storm, a stillness full of possibility and renewal. Sarah sat on the church steps, arms wrapped around her knees, her borrowed flannel soft against her skin. She watched Jacob chase a butterfly through the overgrown yard, his laughter echoing through the open doorway like music played on sunbeams. She hadn't smiled this genuinely in years. Nathan was inside fixing the church door that had begun to squeak on its hinges. He worked methodically, rhythmically, like someone who found peace in repairing small things, even when the larger broken parts couldn't be mended. Sarah observed them both, father and son, as if watching a scene unfold before it became memory. Miss Sarah, Jacob called suddenly, breathless from running. Yes? He jogged over, cheeks flushed and hair wildly disheveled. He held out a slightly crushed wildflower. For you. You're the only lady here, so it's kind of important. Sarah chuckled, accepting it carefully. Important, is it? Yep, he said proudly. Dad says ladies should always receive flowers, even if they're just wildflowers. She glanced toward the church door where Nathan was working, a subtle smile on his lips as he pretended not to overhear. Well, she said, tucking the flower behind her ear, then I'm truly honored. Jacob dropped down beside her on the step, letting his legs dangle. Do you miss your grandma? He asked, his voice gentler now. Sarah blinked at the unexpected question. It wasn't intrusive. It was sincere, the way only children manage. I do, she answered honestly. Every day. What about you? Do you miss your mom? Jacob shrugged. Sometimes, mostly when I'm sick or scared or when I want to tell someone a special secret. Sarah swallowed hard. I bet she was wonderful. She was, he said, but I think maybe she sent you. Sarah turned, eyebrows raised. Me? He nodded confidently. You arrived right when it started raining, just like in storybooks. She laughed, trying to minimize it. I'm not from a storybook, sweetheart. Yes, you are, he stated matter-of-factly. You came in a white dress crying, and now you're happy again. That's magic. Sarah looked away, her throat tightening, and Jacob added shyly, I think if I could have a mom again, it would be you. Time suspended. The breeze halted. The world hushed. Sarah turned to him slowly, her heart racing. Why would you say that? Jacob examined his shoes. Because you talk to me like I'm important, like I'm not too little to understand grown-up things. Sarah blinked back tears. You are important, more than most adults I've met. He beamed. Then maybe we belong together. Inside the church, Nathan had stopped working. He leaned quietly against the doorframe, listening, his gaze never leaving them. He had watched Sarah cautiously at first, not because he distrusted her, but because he couldn't risk trusting something that might vanish again. But now he recognized something different. She didn't grow impatient when Jacob was energetic. She didn't silence him when he asked questions adults found uncomfortable. She didn't speak condescendingly to him. She engaged. She listened. That made all the difference. When Sarah and Jacob returned inside, the atmosphere had shifted. Subtle, but certain. Sarah helped prepare their evening meal. If a can of vegetable soup and 2 dented tins of fruit cocktail could be called that. She stirred the pot over the fire Nathan had built in the old hearth, humming quietly while Jacob told her stories about dinosaurs and robots, and why dragons probably just relocated underground. Nathan watched from nearby, arms folded across his chest, heart heavy with something he hadn't experienced in a long time. Hope. After dinner, they sat on a blanket outside beneath the first stars. The sky was vast and clear, the kind of night sky that made you believe something greater was watching. Jacob dozed off in Sarah's lap, the gentle rhythm of her fingers through his hair lulling him to sleep. Nathan sat beside her, silent for a while. He's never said that before, Nathan finally stated. Sarah didn't pretend to misunderstand. I didn't intend for it, she replied. It just happened. I know. She looked down at the boy resting against her. Does it bother you? She asked softly. Nathan turned to her, firelight illuminating the edges of his weathered but handsome face. I don't know what this is, he said candidly, but I know it feels right, genuine, and I haven't experienced that in years. Sarah studied him, truly examined the weariness in his eyes, the quiet strength in his hands, the sorrow that never turned bitter. I don't want to be a substitute, she whispered, for her, for anything. You're not, he said. You're something entirely different. They sat in silence, allowing that truth to settle like evening dew. Then without words, Sarah leaned her head against his shoulder, just as Jacob had leaned into her. And for the first time, the three of them fit together. Not perfectly, but authentically, like a family not formed by blood or ceremony, but by healing and possibility. Far above, stars twinkled gently, and somewhere in the quiet space between heartbeats, Sarah heard the boy's words echo again. Maybe we belong together. The candles burned low as evening deepened into night. Their flickering light spread across the worn church floor, casting elongated shadows that danced gently on the walls. Outside, crickets sang harmoniously, and the moon just past fullness hovered like a silent witness above the fields. Inside, the three of them sat quietly, Sarah on the front pew, Jacob curled against her side with his head resting in her lap, and Nathan seated across from them on the old altar steps, forearms resting on his knees, observing. There was a hush in the church, not empty, but full, the kind of stillness that follows significant change,